special edition of Coffee Talk, not with Serge, but with me, Ryan Kovar, and I'm very excited to bring on my beloved colleague and coworker, Shannon Davis. And Shannon, we are here today to talk about your wonderful research on ransomware. But before we go further, tradition, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, Ryan, thanks for having me on. Long-time viewer, first-time participant. So I'm a security strategist within Surge, based out of Melbourne, Australia. That was kind of the long and short of it.
Well, you are a terse man at the best of times, Shannon. So I'm not going to hold you to that. The research that you worked on was something that we started looking at, and we released it, I think, about 2 weeks ago now, or 3 weeks ago. It was called an empirically comparative analysis of ransomware binaries, which I think I actually gave you the title, and I was trying to compete for most boring title that has ever been created. If you haven't downloaded it before, please do so. We'll post a link here in the comments now, or somewhere. Anyway, there will be a link with the download. Go ahead and download the white paper. It's a great piece of work. But once you do get it, it looks something like this. It's about a 19-page white paper. We have appendices, so you know we're serious, scientific notation, all sorts of stuff like that. But before we go into the details, Shannon, we're going to be here for about 20 minutes or so. Why don't you give us some background about what this research is and why we started it?
Well, I think I can go from the way we actually started it was you telling me to do something on ransomware. Kind of let me sit there for a good 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 weeks, spinning my wheels, wondering what
I
you
believe
actually
that's called
wanted.
learning. That's learning.
Yeah,
It's an immersive
learning.
experience.
Learning what Kovar wants. So I did a lot of kind of thinking during that time, trying to understand what maybe hasn't been done around ransomware before. Um, I guess, funnily enough, most things around ransomware have been done. One thing that I didn't find at the beginning was any analysis of the actual speed of ransomware. And I'm not talking about the full end-to-end ransomware operation. I'm talking about how long from when they click go to when all of your files are actually encrypted.
And this is an important part because what we do on the team with Surge is strategic cybersecurity research, right? We have a wonderful team that does threat research, named Splunk's Threat Research Team, that does detections, but that's not what we really focus on. We're really going into the bigger ideas and solving security problems with Splunk. And so you kind of went through, you didn't find anyone. Well, that's not true. You did find one group that had actually done analysis on this, right?
Yeah, and that was kind of a little bit into it. And it was, I guess, good and bad. When I started, didn't find any results. And then after I'd actually started some of the work on the analysis bit, I turned up what's showing up on the screen now. The Lockbit ransomware crew actually had done some quite a comprehensive review of other ransomware crews' speed. I guess pretty surprising. I guess not trying to be sarcastic there, that they were the fastest. So their PR team did a good job showing how good they actually were.
Yeah, I was happy for us that there's this great angle that we could do a whole bunch of quantitative research on, but it was a little disturbing to find out that the bad guys had actually done a fairly good bit of legwork here, and we didn't touch too much of that in the white paper, did we?
Not a lot. We called it out. It is something I'll be doing some further work on, though. I'm going to try and replicate, down to the actual binaries they used, and see what results we get on our test bed.
Now, as you went through, and I know you're doing your literature review, this was right about the time that CERT New Zealand released a really wonderful white paper, and we're going to talk about that later on as well. But could you go into that a little bit, like, and just describe how that influenced your research?
Yeah, and that was quite early in the research, and it's a very, very good white paper that they had released, and we've referenced this over and over again. They broke the ransomware, kind of operations up into 3 different phases, like you can see up on the screen there. And really, I guess our main view was how can we get people looking to the left of boom, boom being that very right, phase. And I think they really broke it down into actionable areas that people can actually make use of.
I think what I found most fascinating about the work they did was how it coincided with my experience of being a nation state hunter and looking through the phases of the APT life cycle and how close that was to what we used to do and what still do for nation state hunting, right? From the the reconnaissance to the initial intrusion to the lateral movement. And that was a little bit of a surprise for me to see there was that much of a confluence of events.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that we found, and they wouldn't have been, and saying they, all the ransomware crews wouldn't have been as successful as they have been over the past few years if they didn't follow those same tactics and techniques. It's proven by the big boys in the nation states. So why wouldn't the ransomware crews take those on?
Yep, same idea. Um, to do this, we really wanted to apply scientific method. We wanted to have repeatable results. We wanted to really go through. Can you go a little bit about your methodology here?
Yeah, and that was probably the longest, aspect of this whole thing is bedding down a repeatable process. What we ended up doing was building up a test bed based on, another Splunk research team project called Splunk Attack Range, and we modified that a bit to suit our needs during this research. And what I had done was essentially built up this test bed every single time the exact same way for each one of the different ransomware families we ran. And this was across multiple Windows operating systems, so both Windows 10 and Windows Server. And then we also had multiple performance, specifications for each one of those operating systems. So essentially, four different test beds for each one of the ransomware families that we analyzed.
And how many ransomware families did we end up going through?
We chose 10 because everybody chooses 10 as a nice round number. We took 10 of probably the 10 most prevalent ransomware families over the past 12 to 18 months. Some of those we wanted to actually analyze things like black matter and dark side being, well-known, siblings, in terms of how they actually progressed to one another. And yeah, and just ended up selecting ones based on virus total detections. We used the Microsoft Defender signature within virus total to make sure we were still getting consistent uh, binaries when we actually downloaded and ran these.
This was something I know we had a lot of conversations about the attribution of ransomware. And on the right here of this image, you can see that as Shannon said, we are using Windows Defender, and you can see where the ransomware group is kind of labeled. But we found like actually figuring out which ransomware family, which ransomware gang, which ransomware affiliate, which ransomware malware, those weren't always a one to one, were they?
No, and some of the ones where I'd actually download, let's say a Conti binary, and then actually look into it, and it wasn't Conti. So we did a lot of work weeding out ones that actually weren't, what they said they were, and that happened occasionally. It wasn't super prevalent, but it was just something we were cognizant of to make sure we weren't, doing something that wasn't, true to the research.
Right. So you get these 10 ransomware families. You get about 10 ransomware samples per family, and then you just go through and you double click these all in RDP or on these physical hosts. How did you kind of execute these? Were there any differences or modifications?
Yeah, so we tried replicating what the adversaries would actually do in real life. They're not going to spend their time, going one by one across hundreds or even thousands of hosts in an environment, downloading then double clicking these. What we did was we built up PowerShell scripts to do the downloads across all 10, and then it would actually launch the binaries automatically through that PowerShell script as well. One family we did tend to find some trouble with was a retired ransomware family called Babook. That actually has been its source code leaked, so who knows if we'll see that one, come back to life anytime soon. But Babook didn't play nicely with the PowerShell script for some reason, and we can always go back and analyze that in the data that we have.
So if I'd loaded up a drum roll, I would probably put that on the stream deck and press play right now. But I'm going to pause for a second and ask, I know for me, the most not amusing, but the most interesting finding here was kind of like, oh, ransomware operators are just like us. It was kind of like that. So much of the ransomware was poorly written or didn't execute as well, or I remember we had a phone call, and I don't think you were too happy with me at that point, but I was asking you to rerun all the binaries again so that you could make sure that you got one of each sample all the way through. But part of it was that the ransomware would run fine 5 times in a row, and the sixth it would die, or you'd have one binary that ran once fine in your testing, but then never really executed again. And for me, that was really an interesting finding that showed basically the quality control wasn't always there, even if you were running it in the same identical environment. How, as you kind of went through that, did you have any other findings that were of real interest to you, or is that kind of in line for what you were looking at?
It was in line, and I would say the biggest point where I was unhappy with you was when we went from one operating system type to four. So it went from 100 different ransomware runs to 400. So that really pushed us out quite a bit. But I definitely saw the value in that, and we actually got some feedback externally to do that, which was good. And that was part of our process, was pushing this out to peers in the industry to see what they thought before we actually went through the full thing, and then had those questions after the white paper was released. I'd say some of the interesting things that we ended up seeing beyond just speed, like you mentioned, the quality, where some of these would run through and then die. And that was the whole idea of probably running the 10 different samples from
Yeah.
each family, so we could get median values. Because if one of them dies, great. But if 9 of them succeeded and made it through the 98,000 odd files that we had there, at least we could still get good data from that. Yeah, definitely the code quality was something, and we found that doing more kind of reversing and looking at things like the leaked Conti code versus the leaked Babook code, and seeing the differences and the complexity between those, and that definitely came out in the tests.
Well, that was one of the interesting things too, by doing the different operating systems and then the different spec operating systems. We had gone in, I think we both had biases that we thought like, oh, we know that encryption is a processor tool, right? Like to do mathematical functions, you use a processor. Ergo, you increase the speed of processor, you increase the number of threads, there should be some sort of linear increase, right? If it takes 1 minute to do it with one processor at 2 gigahertz, if you have two processors at 1 gigahertz, it should be twice as fast, or 1 gigahertz up to 2 gig. Like, but that wasn't actually true, was it?
No, for some of the variants it was, because they actually coded that quite well. Other ones where we actually just increased specs, both processors and memory, if we gave some of the variants too much or too many resources, they would just try and grab everything and then die very, very quickly. So some of the actual slower spec machines the ransomware performed faster on those than the higher spec machines. One of the biggest things besides processor, obviously disk speed. So as we increased IOPS and the disk type, that actually sped it up, because the ransomware could read and write to the disk a lot faster. So some of those findings are also included in the data that we have.
So you heard it here, folks. Shannon Davis recommends Windows 98 running SATA drives. That seems to be your best defense against modern ransomware.
Yeah, or even like an NT35 with
NT3, but
some
yes,
yeah, yeah,
get it back when it was real.
yep.
We'll get email over these specs on Exchange 55.
Mhm.
So as promised, Shannon, as I'm bringing this up, who won your ransomware derbies?
So do we have another drum roll for this? Lockbit.
Let
Lockbit
me get
far and
it.
away. Yeah.
That's all I
Do
got.
you have that on your stream deck?
Yep.
Um, the as Lockbit called out, and this will be, I guess, in another one of our blogs that we have, the companion blogs to this research. Truth in Advertising, that Lockbit was, considerably faster than any of the other families. As you can see on the screen there, Babook, the one that we kind of called out as being not that great source code, and not wanting to run via PowerShell, it was still quite quick. And what we had found in a lot of these variants and families was if they're doing partial encryption, obviously that's going to be faster. So Lockbit just goes through and does the first, I think, 4 kilobytes of each file, but uses quite a strong encryption scheme. Um, Other ones that tend to go through and try and encrypt as much of the file as possible can be quite slow. Looking at the Conti source code leak, they do something similar with this, where they go through and they'll analyze the size of the file. If the file's under a certain size, it'll encrypt the whole thing. And then there's 2 other steps where it'll do like a 50% encryption and a 25% encryption. But a lot of enterprise files, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and the like, tend not to be that large unless you're including lots of memes and other things in your documents. So those ransomware families that do partial encryption on the file sizes still tend to hit the disk a lot and try and encrypt most of the file.
So ransomware, for those who saw it, extremely fast for the most part. 42 minutes, I think, was kind of your median average across uh, um, all the different families. And when we kind of look at that, we did some work looking in our literature review. We read things by Mandiant, and the average dwell time for ransomware family is 5 days. And as we go back to what we talked about earlier, that ransomware life cycle, most of those 4 days is actually spent just getting persistence. It's getting on a network. It's doing all this sort of work before they run the ransomware binary. So, we started all this research off with a hypothesis that ransomware encrypted faster than a network defender could recover. And we believe that 42 minutes, the median speed, is faster than the majority of network defenders can actively recover or prevent the encryption of a disk, which is actually a fun part. We don't dig too much into the research, it's another avenue, but we thought we'd see more worming, and we didn't. All right. That was, you only had 1 or 2 families. Is that correct?
Yeah, and some of that comes back to flags that can be passed to these ransomware families at launch. And without doing a lot of reverse engineering on each one of these, that's possibly something we can go back through and rerun some of these after we get the reversing done. Some will do, and we talk about worming. Traditional worming in the past would have been, malware taking a copy of itself and spreading that copy around the network. Uh,
Right.
Modern versions of worming tend to be more, okay, let's go through and discover open SMB shares and try and encrypt that way. It tends to be a lot more stealthy, as opposed to seeing binaries being copied everywhere. If you're doing proper network metadata analysis, you're going to pick that up a lot faster than just SMB. But if you're doing things like we're talking about, the whole kind of left of boom detection, watching for SMB spikes, watching for other things happening, outside of the norm, is a very, very good, defense tactic, as opposed to just looking for things like, static IOCs and other things that can change very, very easily. So doing behavioral based detections, I think, is kind of one of the lessons that people should learn from this research, because a lot of the things that are going to happen in that, the initial access, the consolidation and preparation phases, as called out by CERT New Zealand, there's plenty of opportunity to detect what the ransomware crews are doing in those phases.
Yeah, and kind of when we went through this again, if you look at this document, the bottom right is the encrypt data, right? So that's the actual ransomware binary being executed and encrypting the data. And so you have all these other places: lateral movement, privilege escalation, command and control, malicious document, ingress, malware, email, exploit, all these sort of places where people can actually start looking for this sort of detections rather than waiting for the ransomware binary to run. And it's not saying there isn't a lot of value in being able to detect when a ransomware binary runs, but that there's a lot of places you can actually look to stop there. Shannon, you wrote one of my favorite blogs that was published last year, Listen to Those Pipes, which I think has a lot of validity here. You want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so that was another one where it was kind of like a Kovar mandate, one where I think I wrote a blog before that. I think it was actually an SMB one. And you said, hey, what about doing pipe detection? And that was kind of another learning exercise for myself because I hadn't done a lot of pipe analysis before.
Mhm.
And this tends to be one of the kind of favorite, I guess, methods for adversaries to do things within the network. Opening up, creating pipes as certain services, connecting to the pipes, and then doing their transfer that way, both on a single machine. So even doing anonymous pipes on a single host or named pipes over the network. And one thing I did find, I can't remember if it's in part, I think it's in part 2 of that blog series, was around Cobalt Strike and being able to modify pipe names. So instead of just looking for the out of the box pipe names that Cobalt Strike ships with, start doing again that behavioral detection, because it's very, very straightforward for adversaries to change the names of those pipes.
You brought up Cobalt Strike, and I was talking to a friend this weekend about ransomware and some of the research and kind of getting ready for this conversation. And his point was he has his network defender team working. They don't actually work on ransomware that much. They just work on Cobalt Strike and Metasploit and PowerShell Empire. And their belief is if they can knock those three down for their global network, they've kind of gotten rid of the majority of ransomware threats because, to your point, it's the ingress, right? Like that's the big thing that all these have the similarities on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's that initial entry point, whether it be RDP, whether it be phishing, great. Hopefully you can pick that up. Hopefully you can train people not to keep, 3389 open to the internet or click on things in their emails. But that's going to always, I think, be a problem for us unless, one of us come up with something and we can make billions of dollars on it. I think once they hop in there, doing those detections around common tool sets, and those tool sets are really good. So like we've used them a number of times in Boss of
Yeah.
the Sock to emulate adversaries. No hint for Boss of the Sock 7 are we up to this year? So
7.
if you listen to this, there's no hint there. That I think that yeah, definitely there's a lot of common things that those tool sets do. Whether it be spawning other processes, process hollowing, lots of things that you can detect when those are being used.
So we would be remiss not to talk about all the great content that Splunk has around ransomware, especially for our premium product suite enterprise security content update, all done by our good friends in the threat research team. If you've never used this site before, great place to take a look. You go to research.splunk.com. I'm just going to put in the word ransomware, like I have here, and hit enter. And you see right off the bat, there's 172 analytic stories and playbooks and detections that come up. I've just taken a sample of a couple, but if you've never looked at some of these, they're really great. Each one of these goes to a detection or a playbook. All of this is downloadable in Enterprise Security Content Update today. You don't have to use this site. It's just a great way to visualize it. It's all mapped to MITRE ATT&CK, which makes life super easy for those of us who use it. And of course, you can always try Splunk and Security Cloud. So, highly recommend using this if you've never looked at it before. There's a lot of great ransomware detections, but above and beyond that, there's detections that are really great for all those places that we talked about left of boom in for CERT New Zealand. So take a look at those. You can kind of go across all these great things that can kind of help you find whatever you're looking for ransomware.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that as well, Ryan, is that's kind of an open community. The whole kind of research and detection thing. There is a GitHub repo where if you want to contribute detections and other items to that research community as well, you can. So if you want to submit something, then that possibly could get included in a future ESCU release.
There we go. So we're at about 25 minutes, Shannon. What else do you have coming up for ransomware? What are the next places that you're looking at taking this research?
The next bit was something I was working on with one of our other teammates, Kelsey Bourne, around, I guess, detection of unknown ransomwares based on other malware I don't want to say signatures, because what we're using is fuzzy hashing to run through millions of ransomware samples, build up a corpus of how these look in terms of import tables and other items within the ransomware itself, and then potentially, and I'm using the word potentially here because we don't know the answer yet, potentially be able to use that data to help detect new and unknown ransomware variants just based on that fuzzy hash.
Well, that's the fun part about research. You don't know when you start, but we'll be sharing one way or the other because as always, the team motto is fail less, right? So that's where we go. So thank you very much for joining us. We will be sharing all the different links on the Splunk chat, hopefully as we've gone through, if Shannon, myself, or someone else are doing our jobs correctly. And you can always find Coffee Talk with Sturge every 2 weeks and special episodes with Kovar when they come up as needed. So thank you very much for your time. Shannon, thank you very much. And let's take ourselves away compared to having our normal producer. Thank you very
Thanks.
much.